Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I live alone in a farmhouse just outside a small town in California. It's not the most convenient place to live if you're someone who likes quick access to stores, restaurants, or neighbors, but it's been perfect for me. My house sits in the middle of a few acres of land, with fields on all sides and a few scattered trees in the distance. The nearest neighbor is over a mile away, which I liked at first. The solitude, the quiet, the peace. When I first moved out here 5 years ago, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd gotten tired of the constant noise and stress of city living. The crowded streets, the honking horns, the never-ending hustle. I needed something quieter, something slower, something where I could think clearly. At first, the isolation felt freeing. The days seemed longer, and everything felt simple and calm. I would spend most of my time gardening or working around the property, fixing things here and there, trying to make the house more comfortable. The air was always fresh, the kind of air you can't get in a city, and at night the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. But even in all that peace, there's always this undercurrent of tension, the kind of tension you get when you realize just how alone you are. It's not that I ever felt unsafe, but when you live out here, you realize there's no one around to help if something goes wrong. No phone service most of the time. No neighbors to call in case of an emergency. No one to hear you if you scream. Still, it never really bothered me. Not until that night. The evening started out like any other. I worked in the garden for a few hours, trimming the hedges and watering the plants. It wasn't particularly cold for a late autumn night, but I could feel the chill setting in as the sun disappeared behind the hills. By the time it was dark, I'd finished most of the work and made myself a simple dinner, just some pasta, nothing fancy. I ate in front of the TV, flipping through channels until I found an old crime show I liked. Nothing too exciting, but it was enough to keep my mind off the stillness of the house. Around 11:30, I decided it was time to turn in. I always make sure to lock up before bed. It's just something I do out of habit now, part of my routine. I've always been cautious, and living this far out, it feels like the right thing to do. I checked the windows one by one, making sure each one was closed and locked. Some of them were old, so they didn't always shut properly. I would have to push harder on a few of them, feeling the wood creak and resist, but eventually everything was secured. The last thing I did was lock the front door. It had an old-fashioned deadbolt that always made a satisfying click when it was engaged. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief every time I heard it. After that, I made my way upstairs to my bedroom. The staircase creaked under my feet, a constant reminder of the house's age. I'm used to it by now, though. The house has its quirks, and I've learned to live with them. The floorboards groaned and the walls made strange noises, but I always chalked it up to the house settling. It's old. It's supposed to do that. Once in my room, I undressed, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. The moonlight filtered in through the window, casting a pale glow across the floor. The room was quiet, too quiet, and I could hear my heartbeat thudding in my chest as I lay there, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't really tired yet, so I let my mind wander. I thought about the day, about how peaceful it had been. I thought about the next day, what I needed to get done, what needed fixing around the house. Little things, really. Nothing that felt important. That was when I heard it. It was a sound so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. A soft creak, almost imperceptible. The kind of sound you might hear if someone stepped on an old floorboard. I paused, trying to figure out where it had come from. The house was still. The only sound in the room was my own breathing. But then I heard it again, louder this time, more pronounced. The creak of a door opening. My heart skipped a beat. My first thought was that it was the wind. Maybe one of the windows had been left slightly ajar and the wind was pushing against it, causing the door to move. But I quickly dismissed that idea. All the windows had been checked, all the doors locked. Then it hit me. The sound was coming from the bedroom door. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door. It was slowly opening, the gap between the door and the frame widening inch by inch. The hinges squeaked softly, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. My heart was hammering in my chest now, each beat like a drum in my ears. The door opened further, and I could see a shadow, just a shape at first. It was hard to make out, but I knew someone was standing on the other side. The figure didn't move at first, but I could feel its presence, thick and heavy in the air. I tried to breathe quietly, not wanting to alert whoever it was that I was awake. My body was frozen, trapped in a state of disbelief and fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream? Should I run? Should I stay still and hope they didn't see me? My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. Then the figure stepped into the room. It was a man, a tall, broad-shouldered man. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but I could make out his eyes, wide and panicked, like he didn't expect to be caught. His breath came in shallow, labored gasps, as if he was trying to stay quiet, trying to avoid making a sound. But the more I focused on him, the more I realized that he didn't belong there. He wasn't supposed to be in my house. For a moment, I thought he might just back out and leave. But then he took another step forward, and that's when everything snapped into focus. This wasn't some random burglar. Instincts kicked in. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just acted. I reached for the baseball bat I kept beside my bed. It wasn't a weapon I thought I'd ever use, but in that moment, it was the only thing within arm's reach. The bat felt heavier than I remembered, but I gripped it tightly, my knuckles turning white. My legs felt shaky, but I pushed myself to my feet, my eyes never leaving the man who was now standing just a few feet away from me. He seemed surprised by my movement, but he didn't back down. I could see the tension in his muscles, the way he prepared to lunge. He thought I was an easy target. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I swung the bat with everything I had, aiming for his shoulder. The impact was solid, louder than I expected, and the man staggered back, grunting in pain. I didn't hesitate. I swung again, this time connecting with his head. He crumpled to the ground, his body collapsing with a dull thud. I stood over him for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling. But I couldn't let him get up. I slammed the bedroom door shut, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I didn't know what else to do. My mind was in a blur of panic, but I knew I had to keep him contained. I backed away from the door, my heart still racing in my chest. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. My hands were slick with sweat, but I managed to speak through the fear. "There's someone in my house," I whispered. "I think he's unconscious in my room. Please, hurry." The police arrived what felt like an eternity later. By that time, I was a mess. I'd been sitting in my living room, watching the bedroom door, waiting for him to wake up, wondering what he would do when he did. When the officers finally arrived, they entered my room and found the man lying unconscious on the floor. They told me later that he had a history of drug abuse and had been breaking into homes in the area trying to steal whatever he could. They arrested him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just a random break-in. The police assured me that I'd done the right thing, that I was lucky I'd fought back, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt scared, terrified. The fear didn't go away. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those wide, panicked eyes. Every time I heard a noise in the house now, I froze, expecting to hear the sound of that door creaking open once again. I had the locks changed. I had extra security installed, but no matter what I did, the fear didn't go away. It hasn't gone away. I still remember the weekend I spent at that cabin. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a quiet escape to get away from the chaos of city life. My family owns a small cabin up in the foothills of California, tucked away in a patch of woods. It's been in the family for decades, passed down from generation to generation. They always said the place was perfect for getting away from it all. And for the most part, they were right. I had gone up there alone just to get some peace and quiet, to disconnect from everything. The cabin had a kind of charm to it, old, worn wood with cracks in the walls and creaky floors. But that was what made it feel like home to me. It wasn't a fancy cabin with modern amenities. It was basic. There was a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen with just enough counter space to cook a meal, and a couple of bedrooms. I'd spent many weekends there growing up, fishing by the nearby lake, hiking the trails in the mountains. It was a quiet place, the kind of place that was supposed to bring calm. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. In fact, I didn't even want it to. The idea was simple. Relax, read, maybe cook a few meals, and do some thinking. I had been feeling really stressed out lately, and I figured a weekend at the cabin would be the perfect remedy. The place was secluded, with the nearest neighbor being miles away. It was an old wooden structure, creaky in places, with large windows that looked out into the dense forest. You could hear the wind whistling through the trees at night, and sometimes the animals would stir the leaves, making little sounds that felt like whispers. But on the whole, it was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. I arrived there around mid-afternoon on Friday. The sun was high in the sky, shining through the trees in a warm, golden hue. The air smelled of pine and earth, the kind of scent that you only get in the wilds. I unloaded my bags, grabbed a couple of beers from the cooler, and set up on the porch to enjoy the quiet. The sound of the breeze rustling through the leaves was the only thing breaking the silence, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in a while. But there was something off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on right away. The place felt too quiet, almost unnervingly so. I shook it off as just being alone in the woods, and the feeling passed as I got into the routine of the evening. As dusk started to settle in, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. It felt like the perfect night. Just me, the fire, and a good book. The familiar smell of burning wood mixed with the fresh scent of the outdoors. The sounds of the forest started to come alive around me. I could hear the rustle of animals in the brush and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. For a while, I felt safe, at home even. But that feeling didn't last long. It was around 11 p.m. when I first noticed the light. I had been reading for a while, but then, through the corner of my eye, I caught a brief flash of light outside. At first, it was just a small flicker. I didn't think much of it. I was expecting to hear the sound of a car, maybe someone else coming up the dirt road leading to the cabin, but there was nothing. The light was coming from the woods. A flashlight, its beam bobbing in the darkness, moving through the trees. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just a hiker or someone walking along the trails in the area. It wasn't uncommon for people to wander the woods around here, though it was rare to see anyone at this hour. But then, the light didn't go away. I sat still in my chair, trying to focus on the flickering beam. It moved slowly, purposefully. At first, it seemed like it was just passing through, drifting farther away from the cabin. But then, it stopped. For several long seconds, the light stayed in one place. And then, just as I was about to convince myself I was imagining things, it started moving again. This time, it was coming closer. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure if I should panic or remain calm. Maybe it was just a hiker. I thought again. But there was something about the way the light moved that unsettled me. It wasn't just wandering like someone lost in the woods. It was methodical, precise. Like whoever was holding that flashlight knew exactly where they were going. I stood up from the chair, my pulse quickening. I checked all the windows to see if I could get a better look, but the thick trees outside obscured my view. I felt like I was being watched, like I was part of something I didn't understand. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 11:30 p.m. I decided to lock the doors and windows, just in case. Even if it was a simple hiker, there was no reason for anyone to be out there so late. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call the police? But the nearest sheriff's station was about 40 minutes away. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, hoping to hide in the dark. I crouched down by the window, peeking through the slats in the blinds, and watched as the light got closer. It was moving around the edge of the cabin now, slowly. It was like whoever it was trying to get a better look at the place, circling around it, almost like a predator. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I thought about grabbing a weapon, but all I had was a pocket knife. I didn't even know what I was supposed to do if the person got inside. The footsteps started shortly after. At first, it was just a faint sound on the gravel outside, then louder, like someone walking slowly but deliberately around the cabin. First, they were at the front door. Then they moved to the side, around to the back. They came back to the front, pacing back and forth. It wasn't just one set of footsteps. It sounded like there was more than one person, moving in sync, as if they were trying to make sure I couldn't escape. I stayed quiet, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps got closer. Then they stopped. Completely. I waited, straining my ears. My mind was racing, thinking about every possible scenario. What if someone was already inside? What if they had a way in that I didn't know about? I tried to calm myself down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The air felt thick, like it was closing in around me. I checked the locks on every door again, even though I knew they were already secure. I went to the back door, checked the window locks, the ones I had already checked earlier. Everything was fine, but the footsteps kept coming. By 2 a.m., I couldn't stay awake anymore. My eyes felt heavy, but I still couldn't relax. I eventually drifted off, half sleeping, half waiting for something to happen. It wasn't a restful sleep. I kept jerking awake, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside. But every time I looked, there was nothing. When I woke up the next morning, I felt disoriented. The sunlight was streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. My body ached from not sleeping properly, and the knot in my stomach was still there, tight and uncomfortable. I stood up and walked through the cabin, trying to shake off the remnants of the fear I'd felt the night before. Then I saw the muddy footprints. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I looked closer. The footprints were fresh, wet, and tracked through the hardwood floor, leading from the back door all the way through the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the living room. I followed them with my eyes, my throat going dry. There was no reason for someone to be inside. The doors had been locked. But someone had been inside the cabin while I was asleep. My hands were shaking as I called the sheriff's office. They came over quickly, and when they saw the footprints, they began to look around. They checked every door, every window. They found signs of forced entry on the back door. They checked the cabin. Nothing had been disturbed. No furniture was moved, but all my belongings were taken. The bags, my clothes, my food, everything was gone. It was like someone had come in, rummaged through my things, and taken it all without leaving a single trace of who they were. They tried to track the footprints outside, but they quickly lost the trail in the woods. The prints just stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I haven't gone back to the cabin since that weekend. And honestly, I don't know if I ever will. Every time I close my eyes, I think about that flashlight in the woods, the footsteps that never stopped, the muddy footprints inside the cabin. I remember that night like it was yesterday. It's the kind of night that makes you question everything you thought you knew about safety, about comfort, about the world you live in. A night that shatters the illusion of peace, leaving you with more questions than answers. I've replayed it in my mind countless times, trying to understand what went wrong, why I didn't see the warning signs, and why something so terrifying had to happen to me in the first place. You'd never expect something like that to happen in my neighborhood. I live in a quiet suburban area in California, just outside of Sacramento, where everything feels idyllic. Rows of neat houses, trimmed lawns, kids playing outside, and in the kind of silence you could only find in places that are tucked far away from the chaos of the city. You know the kind of place. It's the kind of neighborhood where you leave your doors unlocked and expect everyone to respect the peace. It's a place that lulls you into a false sense of security, where you start believing nothing bad could ever happen here. But sometimes I think that's the problem. You get so comfortable, so used to the stillness, that when something's off, you don't notice it right away. You don't notice how easily you can be caught off guard. My name's Jake. I'm in my late 20s, and I live alone in a modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city. It's not fancy, just a simple structure, small backyard, a couple of trees scattered around, and a white picket fence that's starting to show its age. It's the kind of house you could easily overlook if you weren't paying attention. It's not anything special, but it's mine, and it's where I've always felt safe, until that night. The only company I have is Max, my dog. Max is a 4-year-old mutt with a big heart and a bit of a nervous streak. He's loyal to the core, but he's no guard dog. He's more the type to cuddle up on the couch with me after a long day, or nudge me with his nose when he thinks it's time for a walk. He's always been my companion, and over the years we've settled into a quiet routine together. After work, we'd go for long walks, play fetch, or just watch TV in silence, a quiet comfort in the chaos of life. That night, though, was different. I had just come off a rough day at work, endless emails, meetings that seemed to go nowhere, and a general sense of exhaustion weighing on me. I was tired, mentally and physically drained, and all I wanted was to get home, grab something to eat, and zone out for a while. I threw together a quick dinner, nothing fancy, and sank into the couch with my phone, aimlessly scrolling through social media. The same posts, the same updates, all blending together as I tried to unwind. The sound of Max gnawing on his favorite chew toy was the only noise in the room. The house felt eerily quiet, a stillness that I took for granted. It was just another night. But then, Max started barking. It wasn't the usual excited bark he gave when he saw a squirrel or heard the neighbor's dog. No, this bark was different. This was frantic, desperate, the kind of barking that made my blood run cold. His growls were deeper, more menacing than I had ever heard. He sounded like he was terrified. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m. The house was pitch dark, and the world outside seemed still, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been awake at that hour, but I could feel something wasn't right. Max's barking had an urgency to it that I couldn't ignore. My stomach dropped, and I stood up, instinctively moving toward the kitchen window. My house backed up against a patch of woods, and I could just make out the dark outline of the trees, swaying slightly in the wind. Beyond them, the soft glow of a distant streetlight illuminated the yard with just enough light for me to see the vague shape of my fence. Max kept barking, louder now, the growls mixing with sharp barks as if he were trying to warn me of something I couldn't yet see. His nails clicked urgently on the hardwood as he scratched at the door, his entire body trembling. I moved toward the back door, trying to calm him down. "Max, it's okay, buddy," I called softly, though I could feel the tension in the air myself. My heart was starting to race, and my mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. I could already feel the fear creeping up my spine, though I didn't want to admit it. Max wasn't having any of it. He barked more frantically, his body stiff with fear. I could tell he wasn't acting like himself. Something was out there. I opened the door just a crack, thinking maybe there was an animal in the yard, maybe a stray cat or raccoon, but I saw nothing. No movement, no shadows, just the empty yard, bathed in a dull, eerie light. Max's barking intensified, and I was about to close the door when I heard it. A rustling noise. It was so faint at first, barely noticeable, like the wind rustling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too controlled. Something or someone was moving quietly in the yard. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer, squinting into the darkness. Max's growls had dropped to a low, guttural sound, like he was warning me to stay back, to be cautious. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I still couldn't see anything. The silence seemed to press down on me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Then I heard it. A footstep. It was soft, almost inaudible, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. Someone was moving closer to my door. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, a chill running through my veins. Before I could even react, I felt it, a sharp tug on the door handle. The sensation was jarring, and I froze. The door creaked open a fraction, and then a hand shot through the gap. It grabbed my arm with a vice-like grip. The panic hit me like a tidal wave, surging through every nerve in my body. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The grip tightened, pulling me toward the door, toward the darkness outside. The cold air rushed in with the smell of sweat and desperation. I knew in that moment, deep in my gut, that this wasn't some prank or misunderstanding. This was real, and whoever it was had a purpose. My brain didn't have time to process the fear. Instinct took over. I slammed the door with all the strength I could muster. The sickening sound of fingers crunching against the door echoed in the night. The grip loosened instantly. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door shut completely and locked it as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding, hands trembling. I could hear my blood rushing in my ears, and I strained to listen. Was he still out there? Was he going to try again? My thoughts scattered in a million directions, but I knew one thing. I needed to call the police. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the sirens to pierce the night. When they finally arrived, the officers took my statement and quickly began searching the area. The bloodstains were easy to follow. They led them to the woods behind my house, where they found the man, barely able to run due to his broken fingers. He was trying to hide, but his wounds were too much for him to escape. When they caught him, I learned he was a local with a criminal record. He had been out of prison for just over a year, and it seemed he hadn't learned his lesson. He was desperate, casing houses in the area, looking for an easy target. It wasn't clear if he had intended to rob me or if something worse was in store. But whatever it was, I knew I had narrowly escaped it. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked at my house differently now. It wasn't the safe sanctuary it used to be. Max had saved me, no question about it. He'd known something was wrong before I could even sense it. His barking, his frantic growls had been the only warning. But the questions linger. How had he known to come to my door that night? Had he been watching me, waiting for the right moment? Why me? Why my house? I'm just a regular guy living alone in a quiet neighborhood. Maybe that was exactly what he was counting on. Maybe it was my normalcy that made me the perfect target. But whatever the reason, I know this. I'll never feel the same way about my house again. And the fear, that nagging, unsettling fear, still clings to me. It always will. I still don't know if it was real or if I just imagined it. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that knocking. It's been weeks since it happened, but I can't shake the feeling that something was out there in the night, waiting. Maybe you'll think I'm crazy after reading this, but I need to share it because it still haunts me. This is my story. My name is Michael, and I'm a park ranger. I work in the far northern part of California, where the woods stretch endlessly in every direction, and the nearest town is more than an hour away. It's the kind of place where, if you don't like the quiet, you won't last long. I've always enjoyed the solitude, the peace of being out there. It's almost therapeutic, being surrounded by so much nature, with the sounds of the forest in the background. But I learned that night that silence, when broken, can be far more unsettling than anything else. The cabin I was staying in was small, just enough space for one person, a small bed, a desk, and a wood stove. The kind of place you'd go if you needed a break from the world. It sat deep within the forest, surrounded by towering pine trees. The smell of the damp earth and pine needles filled the air, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of branches in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I'd been stationed there alone for the last few weeks, taking care of routine tasks and maintenance. It had been a long day, one of those grueling days where the sun sets and you realize you've barely stopped to catch your breath. That night, after dinner, I retired early. The cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp I'd brought with me. There was no electricity in the area, so the atmosphere was always quiet, almost too quiet at times. I liked it that way. The stillness had a certain kind of peace to it. I was lying in bed, the covers pulled tight around me as I tried to fall asleep. The wind outside howled, causing the cabin to creak every now and then. I'd gotten used to the sounds of the place, the way the walls shifted, the way the floorboards groaned. But this night, something felt different. My eyes were heavy and my mind was drifting when suddenly I heard it. Knock. A soft tap. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough to pull me out of my thoughts. I sat up in bed, listening closely. My heart skipped a beat. It was coming from the door. I glanced over at the clock on the wall. 2 a.m. It seemed strange. Who would be out here, miles from the nearest neighbor, knocking on my door at this hour? I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. Knock. Knock. There it was again, louder this time. My pulse quickened. I pushed the blankets off and slowly swung my legs over the side of the bed. The cold floor sent a jolt through my feet as I stood up. I glanced out the small window by the door but saw nothing. Just the darkness of the forest stretching endlessly into the night. I wasn't exactly sure what I was expecting to find. I hadn't seen anyone in days. There were no hikers passing through, no signs of activity. The area was so remote that the only visitors I usually got were the occasional wildlife. The last person I'd seen had been a fellow ranger about 3 days ago. But even if someone were lost, what were the chances they'd show up at my cabin at 2 a.m.? I crept toward the door, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest and my breath felt shallow. The cabin was silent, except for the knocking. It felt like time had stopped, like the whole world outside had disappeared, leaving just that persistent sound. I reached the door and hesitated for a moment. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. There was something desperate in the sound, almost frantic. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was a prank, maybe some kids from a nearby town were messing around. But then again, who would walk out here in the pitch black just to knock on a door in the middle of nowhere? I leaned in, peering through the peephole. Nothing, just the same darkness. My breath fogged up the small glass and I wiped it away, peering again. Still nothing. I pulled back, confused. What was going on? Had I heard it wrong? Maybe it was just the wind or an animal. But just as I was about to turn away, The knocking started again, this time with a force that rattled the entire door. It wasn't like the soft taps I'd heard before. It was loud. Bang! Bang! I flinched at the sound. I stepped back, feeling my chest tighten. Then the handle. It was subtle at first, a faint rattling as though someone was trying to turn the knob from the outside. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, unable to move. The noise was soft but unmistakable. Whoever or whatever was on the other side of that door was trying to get in. I was standing there, unsure of what to do, when the knocking started again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Whispers. At first, they were too quiet to make out. Just soft murmurs that seemed to seep in through the cracks in the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to catch something, anything, that would explain this. But there was nothing. Just soft, almost inaudible murmuring. It was the kind of whisper you can't quite hear but feel in your bones. I stepped back, trembling. My mind raced. What was going on? The whispers grew louder, but still I couldn't make out any words. It was as if someone was speaking in a language I didn't understand. I felt dizzy. Was this a prank, or was something truly out there? I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were almost suffocating, like they were everywhere. They felt like they were inside the cabin, inside my head. I could hear them in the walls, in the floorboards, in the air. It was maddening. My fingers trembled as I grabbed the handle and tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt like it was locked from the outside. Bang! 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 The knocking started again, but this time it was a steady rhythm, as though whoever or whatever was out there was trying to break the door down. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, clutching my head in my hands. The whispering seemed to surround me, and the room began to feel smaller, tighter, like it was closing in on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the knocking stopped. The whispers faded. The silence was deafening. I stayed there on the floor, shaking, unable to move, unable to breathe. The seconds stretched on, and I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if I was wide awake. But when I finally dared to look up, the cabin was still. The door was still locked. The moonlight was streaming through the window, illuminating the room in a cold, eerie glow. I stood up, my legs weak. I approached the door again, unsure of what I would find. The handle was still cold in my hand, but this time I opened it. There was nothing. No one. No signs of anyone having been there. Just the empty, silent woods. The wind was still, and the trees stood motionless in the distance. It was as if the whole thing had been a figment of my imagination. But the knocking had been real. The whispers had been real. I could still hear them in my mind, the sound of them scratching at my consciousness. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been watching me, waiting. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. How could I? What would I even say? I just kept telling myself it was all in my head. But I still think about that night. I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. There are things out there in the woods, things that can't be understood, things that don't belong. And I'll never go back to that cabin again. If you ever find yourself in a remote place, in the dark, alone, and you hear a knock on your door, don't answer it, because there might be anyone out there, and you might not be able to get away from what's waiting for you. It's hard to explain why I'm still haunted by what happened. It's not like I've never been alone before. I'm a city guy, grew up in LA, lived there my whole life, working as a graphic designer. My job isn't anything glamorous, but it pays the bills, and the quiet of working from home allows me to set my own pace. I like my routine, my comfortable apartment in the city with the noise of traffic outside and the constant hum of people. But lately it had all felt like too much. The stress of work had piled on me, and after a long series of deadlines and meetings, I just couldn't handle it anymore. I needed an escape, Something simple, away from the city, where I could clear my head and get some rest. A break, some peace and quiet, no distractions. That's when I found the cabin. The place I rented was tucked away in the remote woods of Northern California, hours from the nearest town. It sounded perfect, isolated, peaceful, just what I needed. I knew it wouldn't be a luxury getaway. In fact, that was part of the appeal. A rustic little cabin surrounded by trees, far from any distractions, where I could unwind. I drove up there on a Thursday morning. The road was winding and narrow, and the further I got into the forest, the more I realized how truly remote this place was. My phone barely had a signal, and there were no cars or houses around. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The dense trees on either side of the road seemed to stretch on forever. It was just me and the forest. By the time I arrived, it was already late afternoon. The cabin was more secluded than I expected. No neighbors in sight, just a thick expanse of trees on all sides. The place itself was small, but it had a certain charm to it. It looked like something out of an old movie, timeless and humble, with its wooden logs weathered from years of standing against the elements. The cabin had a slanted roof, almost like a cottage, and a single stone chimney poked up from the side, giving it an old-world feel. Inside, the air was cool but inviting. The living room was cramped but cozy. A heavy wood stove was the centerpiece of the room, standing against the far wall, its blackened metal frame showing years of use. Next to the stove were two armchairs that looked as if they had been well worn by the many people who had sat in them before me. The upholstery was faded, a mix of grays and browns. On the opposite side of the room, there was a small bookshelf, filled with books that seemed to be older than I was, many of them with cracked spines and yellowed pages. I took a moment to glance at a few of the titles, some old novels, some travel guides, some cookbooks. Nothing too special, but enough to get lost in for a few days. To the left of the room was the small kitchen. It had an old wood-framed window that looked out into the trees, offering a view of nothing but nature. The countertops were made of smooth, dark wood, worn down by time. The sink had a slightly rusted faucet, and the stove was a gas one, ancient but functional. A few mismatched plates and bowls sat on the shelves, their edges chipped and stained. Everything was simple. Everything was old. But that's what I wanted. I didn't come here for luxury. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel away from the world, from the pressure. I wanted a few days to reset. I spent the first night getting settled in. I wasn't sure what time it was when I finally sat down by the stove with a book in hand, but it was getting dark outside. The window was filled with the dimming light of twilight, and the shadows in the cabin grew long. I could hear the occasional creak of the wood as the house settled, and outside, the wind whispered through the trees. It was beautiful, calming. A stark contrast to the constant rush of my life back in LA. The silence was absolute. The cabin was small, but there was a small bedroom off to the right with a simple bed, a dresser, and a narrow window that looked out into the trees. The bed was made with thick woolen blankets that smelled faintly of pine. The floorboards creaked with every step I took, and the wooden walls felt solid and heavy. The kind of place that felt like it could withstand anything. I spent the first couple of hours reading, and then, tired from the drive, I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, but not too soft. It was the kind of bed you could sink into just enough to make you feel relaxed, but not too deep to keep you from waking up to every little noise. That night, I didn't sleep well. I'm not sure why, but something about the stillness of the place kept me awake. The forest around me felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. Not in a scary way, just present, like the trees were watching. I told myself I was being ridiculous and finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight pouring in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. The air was crisp, cool against my skin as I stepped out of bed. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the small table near the window, enjoying the quiet. There was no traffic, no hum of the city, just the soft rustle of leaves outside. It felt good to be away from everything. I spent the day exploring the area. The cabin was surrounded by forest, and there were a few dirt paths leading deeper into the woods. I followed one of the paths for a while, just walking, enjoying the quiet. The trees here were huge. Towering pines and oaks, their branches so thick that very little light filtered through. It felt like a different world, one that existed apart from the usual noise I was used to. The day passed slowly. I spent some time reading, some time outside, and by nightfall I felt completely disconnected from my usual routine. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That night I had a nice fire in the stove and everything seemed perfect. But then, as I was reading, I glanced out the window, and there it was. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but no. There was someone standing just at the edge of the tree line. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. The figure was still there, unmoving, watching me. I could see it clearly now. It was a man, tall and thin, his body hunched as if trying to blend in with the shadows of the trees. His face was obscured by a mask, dark, almost like a burlap sack or some other fabric crudely fashioned into a face. The eyes of the mask were hollow, dark. They seemed to stare right into me. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring back. The figure didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, perfectly still, as though waiting for something. My heart raced in my chest, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the quiet of the forest felt suffocating. I turned away, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just a hiker or someone out for a walk, though there hadn't been any cars on the road when I arrived. Maybe I was imagining things. I tried to calm myself down, but when I looked back at the window a few moments later, the figure was gone. I thought it was over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the figure had just stood there, waiting, watching. I tried to go back to my book, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing over at the window, my eyes darting to the shadows outside, half expecting to see him standing there again. But the forest remained quiet. I told myself it was just my imagination, but a knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. Then I heard it. A tap. Soft but deliberate. I stood up quickly, my heart in my throat. I walked to the back door and stood there, staring at the small window in the doorframe. Outside, the night was pitch black. There was no moon, and the trees were silhouettes against the inky sky. The air was still, too still. Another tap, louder this time. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I call someone? But there was no one to call. I was alone. The knock came again, this time with a gentle rustling sound like something brushing against the door. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy wooden chair, and wedged it in front of the door. I didn't know why. It just felt like the thing to do. Then, another tap. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the chair and with a burst of sudden adrenaline, threw it aside. I swung open the door with all my force, standing in the doorway, my eyes wide and my chest heaving. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my voice harsh and frantic. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I saw him. The figure standing just outside, frozen in shock. He wasn't expecting me to come out. "Get away from here," I shouted, my voice trembling but firm. "I'm calling the sheriff." The man hesitated, his head cocking to one side. His dark eyes glimmered from behind the mask. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever, heart racing, my mind spinning. I don't know if he would have tried to break in if I hadn't confronted him. But in that moment, I realized how close I'd come to something much worse. The next day, I called the sheriff. He said he'd send someone out, and later I found out they'd caught a man breaking into a nearby cabin. He was wearing the same type of mask I described, and they arrested him on the spot. Turns out he had been creeping around isolated cabins for weeks, trying to break in, preying on the solitude of people like me. I left the cabin the next day. The peace and quiet I had sought were shattered, replaced with an overwhelming sense of fear. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't confronted him, but I know one thing for sure: I'll never go back to that cabin. The trees, the silence, the mask, I still can't shake it. I've been home for weeks now, and every time I walk by a window, I feel a knot in my stomach. The thought of that figure in the woods still haunts me. I'll never forget it. Never. And I'll never forget the tap on the door. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.